Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. Dr. Carol Graham is Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, College Park Professor at the University of Maryland, and Senior Scientist at Gallup. She's also my newest guest. Among other things, we talk about her important research on happiness, well-being, and its converse, ill-being, not only in the United States, but in other countries around the world. Hello, everyone. This is my last interview before the summer break. The McKay interview comes off air shortly until the end of August, and my wife and I are off to Portugal to visit family, a much anticipated holiday. I thought it would be a fitting topic before I leave, and for those of you listening who are either about to travel or are already somewhere on vacation, to talk about happiness. Yes, happiness. It's a subject much talked about in many circles, even governments today, and for good reason. Even before COVID-19 struck, there was evidence mounting that while some of us were doing very nicely, thank you, and becoming increasingly more prosperous, there were many more who, for a variety of reasons, were not. And many of you listening may even be aware that there is and has been for the past few years a happiness index, and Switzerland ranks well on that index. According to numbers I've seen in the most recent tables, and my guest today will correct me if I'm wrong, only Finland and Denmark rank above this country, Switzerland. I've called on help better to understand what might at first glance appear quite a simple topic, but on closer examination is much more complex. In fact, my guest today is far away in Washington, D.C., and thanks to the miracle of Zoom technology, I'm able to meet and talk to her directly and share our conversation with all of you. Dr. Carol Graham is the Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at the renowned Brookings Institution. She's also College Park Professor at the University of Maryland and a Senior Scientist at Gallup, the well-known American analytics and advisory company. Her books include, and this is just a snapshot, Happiness for All, Unequal Lives and Hopes in Pursuit of the American Dream, The Pursuit of Happiness, An Economy of Well-Being, Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, that's a wonderful title, Happiness and Hardship, Opportunity and Insecurity in New Market Economies, and the publication list just goes on, and there's more. She's the author of numerous articles in journals including Science, Social Science and Medicine, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Perspectives in Psychological Science, World Bank Research Observer, and the magazine Foreign Affairs. I've only mentioned a few, dear listeners. Dr. Graham is Senior Editor of Behavioral Science and Policy, served on a National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being, metrics, and policy from 2012 to 13, and is a lifetime distinguished scholar from the International Society of Quality of Life Studies in 2018. So dear listeners, we are indeed privileged to have someone of such great quality and expertise explain happiness to us. Hello, Carol, and welcome to the McKay interview. Thanks for making time for me and for our listeners.
Hello, Michael, and thanks for having me.
It's great to meet you at last. Carol, I know that the Brookings Institution is not only highly regarded in the United States and abroad, but also that it was founded over 100 years ago with the mission of becoming the first private organization devoted to analyzing public policy issues at the national level. But that's about all I know. So before we begin, and for the benefit of listeners who might know the name, but not be familiar with what it actually does, please briefly summarize the Brookings Institution and its work. Carol.
Of course, yeah. I always get jokes when I say I work at a think tank. People say, so what do? You just think in there? And maybe so. It is a brain box. It's full of wonderful people. It's interdisciplinary, although economics was clearly its anchor discipline, the first discipline, the first department, and it still remains probably the largest one, but we have a foreign policy studies program, a governance studies program, a metropolitan program, and a global economy and development program. So we do cover quite a range. But what brings everyone there together, and I think makes it much more easy to cross disciplines than it is in a university, is that everybody is brought together by an interest in public policy. So people have standing in their field. but they are not worried about crossing disciplinary boundaries, as is necessary for public policy analysis. And then just two other quick things. We are the oldest and biggest think tank in the United States. And equally important to us is our very staunch independence. We're not just bipartisan, we are nonpartisan and independent. We don't advocate, and we're very careful about obviously maintaining a distance between, funding for our work and the conclusions of our work. That's and then the other thing is it's a really wonderful place to work. A lot of amazing figures in our history have been through there in some way or another. And so it's, I got there very young as a scholar, and I've been in and out in different ways, but I feel quite at home there.
So you clearly enjoy your work.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, we're going to touch on this as we have our conversation, but right at the beginning, just give me an indication of what components go into this quite well-known happiness index.
Right. Well, just to even take a step back from that, when we started this work, there were a few of us at the time considered to be absolutely loopy economists working with psychologists to sort of try and understand the non-income dimensions of human well-being, essentially. And it turned out that psychologists asked all kinds of questions that were very useful for this that economists weren't used to. But economists had the advantage of large N data and sophisticated econometric analysis and all sorts of other analytical tools that can make work, much more statistically significant and reach across huge numbers of and across populations and time. So we used the word happiness initially because, of course, it's catchy and because it's what happened to be in the surveys that existed at the time. But in the end, happiness is, it's not the best term for research. It's a great term for selling books.
Sure.
And the reason for that is you can be happy at the moment. So that's contentment. That's the kind of hedonic or experience dimension of well-being. It's daily moods, daily affect, and those matter to quality of life. But the other dimension that we measure is what we call evaluative well-being. That's your assessment of how your life is over the life course. How satisfied are you with your life?
Yeah.
You can also ask the question, as did some surveys, how happy are you with your life in general? But that's where you enter this confusion between the dimensions. And now the preferred term in analysis is the life satisfaction question. And it's of all of the many metrics that we have, it's if you had to choose one, that's the one you would choose. It's a cognitive evaluation of your life as a whole. So that captures how satisfied you are today, but also with what you've done or what you think about your opportunities. And again, if you think about that kind of measure versus smiling yesterday, money really doesn't matter much to your smiling yesterday. But money is correlated with life satisfaction, not perfectly, but because the more means you have, or at least sufficient means are necessary to lead the kind of life you want to lead, right? It gives you choice in how your life goes. And that, of course, matters a lot to human well-being. So in the happiness index, I was involved in the early part of that project and still am engaged with a wonderful team of people, is basically using national average happiness, although it's based on a life satisfaction question, the measure they use. But again, it comes to the what catches people's attention. And within that index is, average, a measure of national average life satisfaction. What's the average with people in a country answering, on a 0 to 10 ladder, where 0 is the worst life you can imagine, and 10 is the best life you can imagine, where would you place your life? It's called the Cantrell ladder question from Hadley Cantrell in 1950. And that's a robust question, and it works and tracks well across countries and languages around the world. But what the index also does, if you want a bit more nuance to it, which is the more interesting part, in addition to ranking countries for their average score on that measure, and the rankings are pretty intuitive in that very poor, violent countries score at the bottom, and wealthy countries with good social welfare systems and democracy and things people care about score very high. And then there's some surprises like the U.S. not scoring as high as it should. But within that, they do an econometric analysis where they look at what are the determinants of those average scores using the variables that we know are most consistent across people and countries. So GDP per capita is one of those variables. Health is another. Healthy life expectancy is what they use. Freedom to choose, so individual freedom. Social capital, social support, that's another variable. Public goods, some sort of measure of public goods, and also trust and confidence.
Okay.
And the antithesis of that is kind of a lot of corruption, right?
Okay.
So, and so there you see differences across the countries. So the U.S. GDP per capita is a big part of the U.S. scoring high. Public trust is not, and health is not, because we have very divided health system, which is, a lot of people don't have health insurance, whatever. You look at the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland, they score very high because they have high levels of GDP per capita, but they also have very good public goods, good environment, high levels of public trust, high levels of political freedom. And those are kind of the tickets, right?
Okay.
The tickets to being at the top.
So, Carol, let me ask you a more specific question about the United States, where you live. Carol, you live in a country which has the pursuit of happiness written into its Declaration of Independence. It's quite unusual, I think, and yet it scores only 19 in the league table of happy countries, behind the Czech Republic and ahead of Belgium. Now, you've already referred to this a little bit, but let's go into a little bit more detail. Here's my question, has the richest country in the world's pursuit of happiness not been particularly successful, in your view?
So yeah, and I'm very involved in the sort of I have been involved in a lot of the efforts to get well-being metrics into statistics and into government policy priorities as an assessment tool, right? Or as an additional way to gauge the merits of one policy versus another. What does it do for well-being in addition to X, right? It's not trying to replace everything, but you have an additional indicator. So I worked with the UK government very closely. Our National Academy of Sciences panel collaborated with that effort and the OECD's effort, their Better Life Index, and the effort to put guidelines in statistics collection. So if you're going to collect these metrics, here's how you do them well. Because if you don't do it well and you don't do it according to guidelines, you come up with your own measures that don't mean much. They're not, comparable across countries, and they can actually be misleading. So we have these guidelines in place. Lots of countries like New Zealand now are doing very effective policymaking based on using these metrics. The US has been a laggard on this. We're way behind everybody else. And finally now, our federal agencies are starting to collect well-being metrics, but they're collecting only the ill-being ones, anxiety, depression, whatever. I've been commenting they're receptive to changing over time, but they all kind of reinvented the wheel. And it was all because of COVID. All of a sudden there's fear about, mental health crisis here, which exists.
Yeah.
So that's one issue, is that it's almost ironic that the country that has the pursuit of happiness in its Declaration of Independence is well behind all the the wealthy.
It is ironic,
in doing, adding well-being metrics to their stats and to policy. But another issue is much deeper than that, and it has to do with how divided we are. So we're one of the most unequal countries in the world, and it used to be that we sort of played that off against our high levels of opportunity. So we were unequal, but it was a sign that you could, if you worked hard, you got ahead, and that we had high levels of opportunity. That's
and high levels of immigration as well.
Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, if you look at what has happened to intergenerational mobility, it's gone down significantly, almost by half since the 1950s. Raj Chetty's done some amazing work on this. But also, not just intergenerational mobility, but we've become more divided geographically. I've done some work on the drops in our geographic mobility over the past few decades, and it has a lot to do with these dying communities, declining manufacturers communities with large numbers of prime-age males out of the labor force. They're not moving anywhere. They're in very bad shape.
Compared with a generation or two ago.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're much more likely to live in their parents' homes or census tracts as adults than other groups. And they're in the dying parts of the country, the economically dying parts of the country. They tend to be highly represented in deaths of despair, on opioids, high levels of pain, terrible health, obese, high blood pressure, whatever. They're not moving,
Yeah.
right? They don't have the aspirations to find a new job, much less the skills or the finances to move. So we're divided in terms of opportunity. And just the last point on why we're so low on the happiness index, given our income, is that we have higher levels of inequality of well-being than most other countries. So the gaps between the poor and the rich in, say, life satisfaction or stress yesterday, across the poor and the rich in the US are twice or 3 times as big as the gaps between the poor and the rich in Latin America.
Yeah.
So
Even in
not
Latin
only
America.
Latin America on average. So not only is our income and opportunity unequally divided, but even our well-being now is.
So Carol, I just wanted to widen it a little bit now, away from the US. Let's take a step back and look at happiness historically. And I mean, this is an impossible question in the limited time we've got, but just tell me, what did the Greeks, the Romans, the early Christians, the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Confucian Chinese, followers of Islam and Judaism, what have they had to say about happiness? And could you just give me a snapshot? Because what I've read is that religion and deeply held spiritual beliefs have played and still play an important role.
Okay, let me try and answer that question in 2 steps, and I'm not going to be able to cover all your countries.
Okay.
But I can give you the economic and philosophical history a little bit. But let me answer the religion question first.
Please.
It's quite important. So there's a direction of causality problem with that religion statement, which is, we know, for example, that happier people tend to be more religious, or to report that religion is important in their life. So it's not clear that it's the causality goes from religion to happiness. It might go from happiness to religion.
Yeah.
I think it goes both ways. There's a reason for this, and that's because happier people are more likely to be extroverted, to think beyond just an immediate self, and happier people value altruism. They like volunteering. There are all sorts of things where there's a two-way causality. And so religion works that way. What we found looking around the world is, when we broke it up into we found that to the extent to which there's a causality between religion and happiness, we found that for the least social people, who also tended to be less happy, religion gave them a boost by giving them an organized means to socialize. That didn't work for already social people. They didn't need that. For poor people, religion often serves as a safety net. It gives them a community that provides not just material help and support, but spiritual help and support, and friendships and whatever, that serve the poor very well. And for example, for poor African Americans in the United States, the Baptist Church and the community around it is very important. For poor Hispanics, same deal with the Catholic Church. And for the wealthier people, religion sort of provided some sort of spiritual sense of giving back, right? So the direction of causality is dual. Now, for the history, there are a lot of different, from Buddhism to Confucianism to to Greeks and Aristotle, who really was one of the early philosophers that thought about happiness. There is, it's very much about not just a happy life or contentment. It is about going beyond yourself. It's about leading a life of purpose and meaning, right? And that is not just being content, although it's obviously easier to have purpose and meaning and give back if you're at some level, content or satisfied with your life, I think is a better phrase. So Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, with the eu in Greek meaning abundance, and the daimon meaning giving back and controlling your fate, is a combination of having enough means, but also having a purposeful and meaningful life. And so that's quite an important part of the philosophical underpinnings of I'd say of research on well-being. And Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, was very much influenced by Aristotle's concept. The pursuit of happiness is not guaranteed contentment by any means. It's
Absolutely.
about the opportunity to lead a fulfilling life.
Yeah. Okay. My guest today is Dr. Carol Graham, Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at the renowned Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and an acknowledged expert on happiness, and that's what we're talking about. Carol, please can you talk a little bit more about optimism and despair in the United States and how it feeds or has fed into politics and societal friction?
Yeah, that's a topic I'm working a lot on. I was born in Peru and have done a lot of work on happiness around the world, as in the title of one of my books, and showing how the determinants of well-being are very similar across people and populations everywhere, even very poor ones. People tend to value many of the same things. They want to have a good life, a purposeful life. They like giving back. They need enough means. They do much better if there's freedom and public goods, and so on and so forth. But the U.S., as I mentioned, is very divided now. In fact, even when we started the whole idea of the World Happiness Report in 2012, the U.S. scored 10th. So we've dropped.
Really?
Yeah, it's a remarkable drop.
Quite a bit.
A lot.
Yeah.
And it shows in what's going on now. So we're the only, prior to COVID, we were the only wealthy country in the world where our mortality rate was going up rather than down, driven by premature deaths among less than college educated, middle-aged whites, the so-called deaths of despair. These are deaths due to suicide, overdose.
You call them deaths of despair, did you say?
Deaths of despair, yeah, despair-related deaths.
I hadn't heard that before.
So it's due to suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol poisoning. COVID has obviously exacerbated this. Overdoses have almost doubled between 2019 and 2020. Suicide, not so much, but the overdose suicide, the line between them is often very blurry. And so this is really widespread despair, and it's part of it is a result of deindustrialization, for sure, the decline of manufacturing. Looking back over time, we found that optimism dropped among less than college-educated white males in the late 70s with the first decline of manufacturing.
And you're saying, when you say that, you mean heavy industry, coal mining, steel, or a wider spread?
Wider spread, auto manufacturing, the whole, we're seeing these trends in many rich countries. Yeah. They're just more extreme here, in part due to the way the dispersion in which geographic dispersion in which manufacturing firms spread out to more poor rural places with each decline in manufacturing. So what you ended up having, with the first wave, manufacturing declined in cities. But cities are remarkably good at reinventing themselves. They have a concentration of people and resources. I mean, there's some that never do, but a lot of them do. But then they moved to the suburbs. And then the last wave of kind of the manufacturing decline in the early 2000s, when the IT boom hit, and a lot of, there was just another sort of switch again in the way things were produced and in the viability of a lot of manufacturing firms. They moved to very poor rural places, to remote places, because it was cheaper.
Yeah.
But then they became one-horse towns. Yes. So when the firm died, yeah, everything all died. The support shops, all those things died. They were typically primarily white or homogeneously white communities, more in the heartland of the country as opposed to the coast, which are more diverse and more vibrant. Yeah. And so, yeah, obviously that created its own despair. But what is really interesting is that minorities are not in those deaths by any means as much as whites. They're hardly represented. And there's a reason for that. And that's because over time, minorities are much more resilient. They're much more likely to believe in the American dream. They're much more likely, low-income minorities are much more likely, the kids are much more likely to pursue college than our poor white kids who are skeptical now of the coastal elites and universities and science. So this has become a much bigger phenomenon that's terrifying, actually. But minorities have, over time, they never had the good jobs. They never had privileged access to the good jobs. So their narrative was very different. One, you stick together. They built communities of empathy, whether it was churches or extended families. They understood when somebody fell behind that it wasn't just you work hard, you get ahead. If you're poor, you're a loser, which was kind of the ugly side of the American dream narrative. And they realized education was their only ticket out.
Up to mobility, yeah.
Yeah, and
Social
so
mobility.
what you're seeing now is it's despair due to economic trends, but also not having prepared to deal with the next generation, right? I'm doing surveys. I started these in Latin America and Peru of how optimistic adolescents who had high hopes for education actually achieved those hopes. And these are low-income adolescents. I'm doing them in poor white and poor black neighborhoods in Missouri, right in the
Yes.
heartland.
Yes.
So conditional on graduating from high school, which is more difficult for the African-American kids, they're much more likely to pursue college, and their parents support it. They may not be able to support it financially, but they support the aspiration to go to college.
So
the poor white kids don't aspire to go beyond high school, and their parents don't support them going beyond high school. So they're just going to be the next generation in despair, because with a high school degree only now, you're not going to make it in the future economy.
So let me ask you, I'm keeping one eye on the clock, Carol. I just wanted to get a couple more questions in before we finish. You're an academic and a researcher dealing in facts and the analysis of data. What evidence do you have in front of you that gives you cause for optimism for the large number of people in your own country that are not doing so well at the moment? What policies, this is the key because you're in a think tank which deals in policies, what policies and programs will it take to improve their lot?
So I have thought a lot about this, which is not a surprise given where I sit. But and in fact, I made a proposal in our Brookings Blueprint series that I think now we're writing a white paper about with people from a collection of academics and policymakers and people in the agencies. It's basically recommending that we have to deal with this crisis of despair as part of our economic recovery, because we cannot recover economically if we have 20% of prime age males out of the labor force, and that's a pre-COVID figure, and that means they've just given up, right? Before COVID, we had record low numbers of unemployment, 4%. At 20% of the prime age males are out of the labor force, so they drop out of the ratio, right?
Yeah.
That's not sustainable. So we have, and a lot of it has to do with, what despair has turned into and what the root causes. And a lot of them have to do with no hope. If you look at, we do these maps of well-being and deaths of despair. So if you look at the counties across the country and the states across the country that have high levels of deaths of despair, they also have low levels of hope, high levels of worry, high levels of reported pain, reliance on disability, and drug overdose.
So
right?
what policies do you recommend that
So
can
right.
deal
So
with that?
so to the policies, yeah, there are a lot of different angles on this, and our recommendation is that the efforts need to coordinate with each other, because right now we have the overdose people, Office of National Drug Control Policy doing one thing, the suicide agency SAMHSA doing another thing. The local efforts, a lot of vibrant local efforts that try and improve well-being. They enhance individual and community well-being by getting people, providing opportunities to volunteer, join, just to get isolated, depressed people out of their homes and into the community is a first step. They're doing amazing work, but again, they're in silos. And then there's a lot of promising work in the mental health arena. Mental health is completely underfunded and undercovered in the U.S., but we have people doing amazing experimental work, trying to telework to get mental health help to people who are very remote and far away from any providers. All kinds of new efforts to follow up. One we all know from mental health, you can't just see somebody once and then it's all over.
Sure.
And just to place a value on mental health and less stigma. So there's a wonderful new OECD initiative that I'm involved in called Brain Capital. And it's basically saying we have to, as societies around the world, invest in brain capital as the part of the future of work. That it isn't just about poor mental health, that's an important part of it, but it's also about the kinds of cognitive skills that young adults are going to need to navigate the new future of work. And this is obviously particularly important for deprived kids that don't have immediate access to a college education
Sure.
or a mentor that shows them what kind of skills they need to get. It doesn't have to be college education, but there are a host of cognitive skills and social skills that people are going to need to get decent jobs in the future of work. And all these things have to at some level coordinate with each other, because the lack of progress in any of these areas is very much a part of the crisis of despair we have.
Thanks. Carol, I've read some of your papers. This is my last question. I've read some of your papers, and you've mentioned already the word hope. The word hope crops up quite a lot in the papers I've read. Could you just expand a little bit more on hope seen through your lens and the lens of COVID-19? How has the pandemic affected happiness? You touched on it a little earlier, but just go into a little bit more detail before we wind up.
So hope is, in my view, it's a new dimension that we're measuring separately, beyond life satisfaction. I'm hoping to make it its own discrete dimension of well-being, because I think it's the one that's most causally linked to better future outcomes. It's very clear to me that without hope, people don't invest in their futures, and they're much more likely to engage in risky behaviors that jeopardize those futures. I've shown this empirically. I had the first paper on how in 2004, and was laughed at the time, and now it's my most cited paper, on how people who had high hopes for their future mobility actually did better in the future, and that hope was an important channel. And it's a particularly important channel for people who are either discriminated against or start with deprivation, because they have less assets to leverage against their futures. Hope, but you need hope and agency. Hope is not just, God will take care of it. It's very much, it's got to be linked to a sense of agency. And that's where policy can help. So policy can't necessarily play in people's brains and make them hopeful if they're not. But poverty can give people tools that show them that they can control their future, that give them some tools to help them control their future. And that in and of itself produces hope. So there's a lot in this area. And we also find that hopeful people live longer. I mean, there's a lot of their health benefits.
Is that a fact?
Too.
Hopeful people live longer.
Yeah. We have a paper on optimism and longevity based on historical data in the United States. And there's other evidence of that as well. So it's, and the last, I think, policy relevant part of this story, although we still have to disentangle if it's a possibility, is what can we learn from resilient and hopeful minorities, people who have made it against all odds and who remain hopeful even, during the George Floyd protests, or even another example is during COVID. Even though minorities, and particularly African Americans, were the hardest hit by COVID incidents and death, they are the most hopeful and optimistic group still. Their anxiety increased. It would be kind of crazy if it hadn't, right? But they remain hopeful and optimistic. What determines that? And a lot of it has to do with the role of community, and having a foot in a community and wanting to give back to a community, even if you are relatively deprived. And one of the things that's lacking among the sort of desperate, declining white working class is that the old narrative was kind of the Ozzie and Harriet 4-person family, working dad, wife and home, 2 kids. If you worked hard, you got ahead, you had a stable, respected, lower middle class life. You didn't need the government, you didn't need, and all these government policies, welfare policies, were for those loser minorities. That narrative is gone, but there isn't one to replace it. And how do you build that? I don't know the answer to it. I think we're learning a lot from all these disparate policies, but I think that's going to be the ticket. And, Make America Great Again was a great big lie. And let's go back to, it was Make America White Again, essentially, right? And it opened up lots of demoniacal boxes, and we have to fix that now too. But, I guess it's all possible.
Carol, I think there's a second program, there's a second interview in this, because we could keep talking much, much longer, but unfortunately we're timed out. Look, thanks so much for the stimulating conversation. I've learned a lot. There's much more for me to learn. You have to keep on sending me things to read, Carol, because I find them absolutely fascinating. And I'm really grateful to you. My guest today has been Dr. Carol Graham of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Thank you again, Carol.
Well, thank you, and for the wonderful questions.
Thank you for listening. Please share the show with those around you, and if you have any questions or feedback, write to me at contact@mackays.ch. I promise that I will reply to you.